record on this computer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Friends, I'm here with my good friend and the president of NANO, the National Association of Nonprofit Organizations and Executives, Louis Fawcett. Louis has spent his entire career in nonprofit management, whether it was parish ministry or raising millions for children's homes overseas, whether it was China, Ethiopia, Haiti. When I met him, he was the vice president of principal gifts for an educational organization here in South Carolina. So here is a man who's dedicated his entire life to ensure other people experience a life worth living. He's one of my personal heroes, and he is the new author of Reimagining Nonprofits. You know, I started with Reimagining Philanthropy, where I challenged donors to give differently, to have a different set of expectations. But Louis said that's not enough. Jimmy, if you'll change the donors, I'll work on changing the individual nonprofit organization so donors would more gladly invest in them. And out of that effort came the new book, Reimagining Nonprofits. Pal, it's always good to be with you. Been here 1,000 times. Can't wait to hear what's new. Go ahead.
Jimmy, thanks so much. You're exactly right. You wrote Reimagining Philanthropy to Donors, and what we continue to confront in the nonprofit sector is brokenness within nonprofits. Brokenness with the way the staff is structured, brokenness with boards, brokenness with the way donors want to be involved with nonprofits. The entire way the nonprofit sector has been set up and has been handed to us is broken, and it needs to be fixed. And so that is the passion and motivation behind Reimagining Nonprofits. What I do in the beginning of the book is lay out the brokenness. I describe how bad things are. It's a look in the mirror. And then in the next 10 chapters, I lay out solutions that can be implemented by any nonprofit of any size anywhere in the country.
Louis, I think as we've worked together for almost close to a decade now, one of our axioms that we follow, that we abide by, is a nonprofit is engaging in certain behavior. Would they get away with this in the for-profit sector? And that has been a spectacular guide rail for us. I think that may be undergirding your first 5 chapters. How are nonprofits broken?
So there are only 2 sides to the equation when it comes to running a business: revenue and expenses. And it's the same for nonprofits. And nonprofits have been too focused on program and service delivery and spending all their money every day, working hard today to pay for yesterday's bills, and not focused enough on revenue and running their organization like a business. It's a different tax status, but the day-to-day still has to be run like any good business. Now, the other issue we face in the nonprofit sector is piety. We all want to be nice to each other. We think, well, if someone wants to work here, they should have that opportunity. We don't want to let anyone go. And so what happens is we end up with parasites and performers. And some people understand performance. They come to work, they work hard, and they generate revenue or provide a program or a service for the community. They're performers. But then they're parasites, Jimmy. They're people who show up for their job and they live out their dysfunction within the nonprofit. And all too often, nonprofits have become a playground for dysfunctional people because we want to be nice and we don't want to hold people accountable for performance. So when we talk about performance metrics, yes, performance metrics for people who are generating revenue, and also performance metrics for people who are delivering programs and services.
You know, what if we stay there for a minute? I wonder, on an annual basis, if the board of directors could evaluate the CEO on certain metrics. And maybe then you'll move on to how the CEO evaluates in the C-suite, let's say the chief development officer. So the board holding the CEO accountable to metrics, the CEO holding the organization accountable to fundraising metrics. Why don't you take it from there?
Yes. So every year, the CEO should set two goals: a goal for revenue generation and a goal for impact. How many lives are we going to change and save, and in what ways? What is going to be the breadth and the depth of our impact? How much is that going to cost? She should have a plan for generating this revenue and a plan for deploying this impact. And she should present that plan to the board and then be evaluated based on how the organization meets those goals. Now, I have to say, Jimmy, at that point, the board needs to get out of the way. They've hired the CEO to do a job, and they should trust her to do that job. Of course, she's going to provide updates. Of course, there are going to be changes through the year. Of course, there are going to be things that go well and things that don't go well that we need to adjust. So I'm not suggesting it's, hey, let's meet once a year and come back and see each other a year later and find out whether to hire or fire the CEO, or rehire or fire the CEO. I am suggesting there has to be accountability, and then the CEO needs to be set free to hold her team accountable as well.
Louis, before you go on to evaluating somebody in the C-suite, I think it's okay to say board of directors can go for years with a particular chief executive officer and rely on the president's report or the executive director's report and are not intentional about performance evaluation. So yes, two areas: accountability for finance, accountability for impact. But what about the fact that our average board is not used to going through that process and holding the organization accountable? That's our current culture.
Right. People join boards to feel good about themselves. Now, they also join boards in the for-profit sector because they are stockholders, because they have a true stake in the success of the company. And those boards are much more apt to hold CEOs accountable for performance because they want to see the stock price go up so they can make money. In the nonprofit sector, we have a tendency to recruit board members that we like as people. People want to serve to feel good about what they're doing in their community. Most board members want to take the path of least resistance. They don't really want to get involved in the nitty-gritty of what the organization is doing because that's going to create more work for them. And so this is a wonderful solution for boards to be able to hire a CEO, trust her to do the job, and then hold her accountable.
Louis, now with the CEO working with the C-suite, let me just propose that this is a small organization. They have a director of development. They also have an administrative assistant. And let's say they have somebody handling the data, what we would call donor relations. That's the development team. I have found more commonly than not that those individuals can go year after year after year and not raise measurable additional funds and still remain in their position. What does reimagining nonprofits have to say about that?
So part of the brokenness of the nonprofit sector is around not holding people accountable, not setting goals for their revenue generation and the metrics for the way they meaningfully interact with donors. And so part of what I present in the solutions in the book is how to monetize every hour of every day to spend with major donors. Because in the small shop that you just described, we're not going to raise millions of dollars, $25 at a time. We've got to spend time with our top 100. And if we're going to do that, we need to treat our top donors like our customers. Not like ATM machines where we just go to them once a year and ask for money, but we treat them like our customers where we're cultivating that relationship, helping them meet their goals for changing and saving lives in the community, and then asking them to invest in this impact.
Louis, I've had the privilege of reading Reimagining Nonprofits a number of times. You know, holding people accountable to numbers is one thing, but what about that scale, that mission? How does a nonprofit actually define success so that we're actually accountable to impact at a higher level than we never dreamed possible?
So here's what's wonderful about revenue is it provides opportunities for us to create more impact. We're not going to cut our expenses and think that we're going to change and save more lives. It's actually the opposite. When we focus on revenue generation, then we're able to hire more people and better people to do the work of changing and saving lives. And when I say better people, I mean people who have more experience, who have more wisdom and are harder working. And too often what we do in the nonprofit sector is we bottom feed on talent on the service side. And we bring in people who may have a background, they may have a passion, they may want to do the job, but they don't have the skill set to grow the program and grow the impact year over year over year. So it's both. We have to be growing revenue so that we can grow impact. We have to grow impact so that we can prove that we need to continue to grow revenue.
Louis, now you've shared that the board should be holding the CEO accountable for finance and impact. But what is the current state of our average board at the local level? Now, you know, I'm not talking about the Gates Foundation. I'm not talking about Mackenzie's Foundation, but I'm talking about your average nonprofit. How is their board structured, and is it correct?
I think the average nonprofit board has 15 to 20 members. They have a third of those 15 to 20 hardly ever show up, if at all, but they're on the board. But it's likely the executive director or CEO may not even recognize them in the grocery store. Oh. Then you have another third of the board that shows up for half or more of the meetings, and then the event, you know, the gala every year, and will maybe give a gift to the organization. And then we have a third of the board that's really doing the work, that's digging in to the programs and the P&L to understand where we are with revenue and impact, and is providing wisdom and guidance for the CEO or executive director. So it does beg the question, why do we need 15 or 20 people on a board when we could really have 5 or 6, those top third, who are really invested in helping this organization move forward?
You know, I would argue with that working group being 5 to 7 people, it is more agile. It is more inspirational to one another because they're all bearing up the load in the same manner. Now,
it also, sorry to interrupt, Jimmy, but it also eliminates this craziness, frankly, of these monthly board meetings where we come in and we stare at reports, spreadsheets, reports from the CEO or executive director, maybe reports from program directors, and the board is expected to nitpick these reports and have something to say about them. And we don't need to be doing that. That really is a waste of time. Where the board should be concentrating its efforts is on hiring the right CEO and charging her with doing this job and evaluating her, so holding her accountable, and then providing advice throughout the year in their subject matter expert area. So if they're an attorney, a CPA, a social worker, a marketing executive, they should be on call, as it were, for the CEO to say, pick up the phone and say, hey, I need to run this by you from a legal perspective. Hey, we've got an accounting question. So rather than wasting 20, 40 hours a year in meetings, what if we met 2 or 3 or 4 times and then reserve the rest of that time for the CEO to call on them one-on-one when some advice is needed?
Advice and accountability. So Louis, you just shared with the group what we kind of see as the average board. You divide it up into a third, a third, and a third. As it relates to the first 5 chapters and what is broken, do we have all the right CEOs in place at nonprofits? And if we don't, what's the answer?
Well, part of the reason, Jimmy, frankly, and this is not the nonprofit's fault, it's not the staff's fault, it's not the board's fault. This is a cultural issue that we have to confront. And it's a cultural issue where we value lattes over orphans. We have no problem with the Starbucks executive being paid hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars to be a purveyor of heart disease and diabetes, but somehow we have a problem with a nonprofit CEO being paid a couple $100,000 to run a $5 or $10 million organization. And so this is where we go back to revenue generation, because we have to focus on revenue generation so that we can hire and retain talent. Most of the talent, Jimmy, goes either to the corporate sector, the small business sector, or the government sector. And the talent we end up with in the nonprofit sector goes first to hospitals and universities, and then to the largest nonprofits. Why? Because they pay, because they provide benefits, because they provide retirement. And so it's not the nonprofit's fault, but we have inherited this piety around, oh, if you come to work for us, we're going to pay you very little. We're going to expect you to work 50, 60 hours a week. And oh, by the way, you're not going to get health care or retirement.
Louis, I don't want to run our audience off here. I remember the issue, we've talked about boards, we've talked about CEOs, but tell me about founders. I remember you created a metaphor of Mr. I love myself. And by the way, I are one, so it's okay. But what about the issues of founders and management?
So there's a whole chapter in the book related to founder syndrome. And I describe Mr. Love Thyself, who starts this nonprofit out of the goodness of his heart. But the problem with founders is they begin to see the nonprofit like their child, and they take any criticism or any change that needs to happen in the nonprofit as a personal criticism of themselves. They're unable to separate themselves emotionally from the nonprofit because they invest years in getting the nonprofit started. They invest tens or hundreds of thousands of their own dollars to get the nonprofit started. And then when they get to the point of needing to grow and needing to scale, it means they have to bring on staff who are competent, who have other ideas, people with other skill sets. And founders are very often reticent to let go. And the tighter they hold on to their organization, the more they hurt the very people they're trying to help. And so that's why I spend a whole chapter on founder syndrome, because it is a disease within the nonprofit sector.
Well, the great thing is that I know that you have answers that can even help me as a founder get out of my own way and putting together that team that allows me to accomplish my goals in a way I never thought were possible. So, I think we did a good job this first 10 minutes about overviewing some of the issues we fight systemically as the problem. What are some of the solutions? Because you got 10 chapters for that.
Right. So let me run down them, Jimmy. Number one, treat your donors as your customers. If you look at the best corporations in the world, they provide an experience for their customer, and they devote millions and millions of dollars on retaining existing customers and upselling them. And if we can learn to create an experience for our donors and understand that donors will invest more when we invest more in them, then our time priorities begin to shift. Instead of spending 95 to 99% of our time on program service delivery, what if we spend at least half of our time on the needs of our customers, i.e. our donors? So I describe methods for doing that. Then we have to know our numbers. Jimmy, you would be astonished. I talk to nonprofit leaders every day and I'll say, well, what was your revenue last year? And they don't know. I'll say, well, how many people did you help last year? Well, I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up. A corporate executive is expected to know her numbers backward and forward. And so too should a nonprofit executive and staff member know our numbers, because if we don't know our numbers, we can't grow them. Then we need the strong CEO. We've talked a lot about that. That's really important. We need proper staff compensation. Just mentioned that a few minutes earlier. We need to pay our people what they're worth and offer health care and retirement so that we can retain them rather than turning them over every 12 to 18 months. We need to get boards out of the way. Boards don't need to be micromanaging the day-to-day operations of the organizations. Boards need to be there for advice and accountability. We need to eliminate piety. We've got to stop thinking about the nonprofit sector as somehow different than another business. It occupies a different tax status, but in terms of the way we run the nonprofit, it has to be run like a business, not a hobby. It's not about how we feel. It's about how the numbers are generated. In order to generate those numbers, we have to monetize every hour. We don't have time to waste on the same old staff meetings, the same old events, the same old tired board meetings. How many nonprofits, Jimmy, the CEO comes out of a board meeting and has got 4 or 5 things to do, and by the time she gets those 4 or 5 things done to report back to the board, has to start preparing for the next board meeting. How many nonprofits are spending 2 hours, 3 hours a week on staff meetings instead of being out doing their job and focusing on their donors?
Louis, let me put you on the spot. We do this when we're in front of large audiences. What you just talked about was monetizing every hour. Are you able to get your phone? Let's say it's a $5 million organization. Do you mind going through that exercise real quick?
Sure. How about if I do it for a 3 million organization? That may be more typical. So if you have a $3 million organization, you've got 48 weeks to raise $3 million, which means I want you to have 4 weeks off. You should have time with your family. You should have time to have fun. Within those 48 weeks, you've got 40 hours. It's not healthy to work 50, 60, 70 hours a week. We should have a normal 40-hour work week. So if you're going to raise $3 million over 48 weeks at 40 hours a week, it means that you need to raise $1,562.50 every hour. So if we're doing anything that's not worth at least $1,562, Jimmy, then we shouldn't be doing it.
Right. Keep moving through the solutions.
So then we go into events. Events are the bane of most nonprofits' existences, right? Because our staff spends hours and hours and hours planning and pulling off these events, and then they're exhausted and burned out, and then we're not monetizing them. I mean, how many events have we heard of where we're only generating 28,000, 45,000, and yet we're spending hundreds of staff hours? So we have a solution in the book where you have a 1 2-hour event every year that's a dinner and a few speakers talking about how lives have been changed and saved by the organization. And then we make an ask and we do a live tally. Jimmy, we've done hundreds of these events and we always raise at least $300,000 or $400,000, sometimes over $1 million in one evening. The staff is not burned out. The donors are happy that we've respected their time with 2 hours on a Thursday night, and people leave feeling great about what they've done to help their community. Then we've got to, without apology, put a price tag on our mission. Instead of saying, well, just give what's on your heart or just give what makes sense to you. By the way, we would never do that with any other product or service in our world, right? The car dealer never says to you, oh, you want to drive off the lot in this Hyundai? Well, just give what's on your heart. No, there's a price tag. If you want a product or a service, you have to assess the value of that product or service. And it's no different in the nonprofit sector. And so we have to start asking people for concrete amounts. Jimmy, if you'd like to help 300 kids in our after school program, we thought you'd like to consider an investment of $25,000 that would enable us to serve those 300 kids for 6 months of this year. See, that puts a price tag for you as the donor. Now you've got a place to start. You may decide to give more, you may decide to give less, but now you know what the impact costs, and we've got to do that without apology. And that number has to include everything, not just what it costs for the books or the pencils or the curriculum, but everything that it costs to run the organization has to be included in your mission's price tag. And finally, Jimmy, we've got to spend time with people one-on-one. And I know it's a lot of work. And it's a lot of work to call people, to schedule meetings, to reschedule meetings. But we find over and over again, Jimmy, that when we sit down with our donors, when we sit down with our board members, when we sit down with our staff members, when we sit down with our volunteers one-on-one and have a conversation about getting to know each other, and then transition that conversation to, I'd like to run some ideas by you. I'd like to get your advice on what we're facing with this nonprofit. We find over and over again, those conversations lead significantly to growing revenue and growing impact. Contrast that to the CEO who wants to go into a staff meeting or a board meeting or an event and cast this wonderful vision and expect everyone to get behind it. It just doesn't work that way. We have to start one-on-one.
You know, Louis, as we end up closing up this this first session, you identified in the first 5 chapters the issues. You went through briefly the 10 solutions that change everything. But I really think those 9 solutions end up being the 10th solution. And let me tell you what I mean by this. I'm a firm believer in luck. And the harder I work, the more I seem to have of it. Now, am I going to work hard in staff meetings? I'm going to work hard in emails. Am I going to work hard in preparing for a board meeting? Or rather, am I going to work hard externally, being forward facing and spending hour after hour after hour in the community? That's where we get that highest return. I feel like I'm just saying the same thing that you just said louder, but let me just posit this to you. It feels like to me, everything ends up being in reimagining nonprofits about freeing up key individuals to be in the field to create new opportunities. Your thoughts?
Exactly. You're going to work one way or the other. It's what I tell my kids, Jimmy, right? You're going to work. There's not going to be a free ride in this life. So you might as well do something that you love and make a meaningful difference with your work. And instead of sitting in the office and doing all the things that we do to justify having our job at our nonprofit, we have to look in the mirror at ourselves first and then our organization and say, if we're going to make significant change, if we're not just going to service a problem, but we're going to eradicate this problem in our community, then we're going to have to do things differently. And differently starts with being out of the office instead of in the office.
Friends, the book is Reimagining Nonprofits. The author is Louis Fawcett, the president of NANO, the National Association of Nonprofit Organizations and Executives. Go to any search engine, put in Louis Fawcett, Reimagining Nonprofits, and you're going to find easy access to buy this tome, to buy this declarative, transformative book for every one of your staff members, every one of your board members. It's going to be the greatest gift that you give them, as well as the organization that you serve. Louis, it's no small thing to write a book. We all appreciate your investment. Thanks, pal.
Thanks, Jimmy. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to hearing from all of you.
Give us a ring back, friends. God bless.